In previous discussions, we explored complexity, situations where cause and effect only become clear over time. Today, we look at a second structural force shaping project outcomes, and that's change. Change in projects is usually discussed as disruptive, scope variation, delays, and rework. That's only part of the picture. Projects experience two very different kinds of change, and they're not always bad. The first kind of change is informational change. As engineering progresses, knowledge emerges and uncertainty reduces. The second kind of change is structural change, and that's when the nature of the decision environment itself shifts. Predictable work can become exploratory again, and exploratory work can stabilize. Most delivery systems are designed to handle the first. Very few are designed to handle the second. In my experience, handling structural change successfully leads to handling information change as well, and consequently reduces project cost, timelines, and blowout risks. So let's look at information change. Information change is the gradual improvement of knowledge. In short, it's what happens when we learn. Examples include learning that ground conditions differ from early surveys, or design interfaces behave differently in detail than in concept, or the supply market shifts unexpectedly, or you get regulatory clarification. Informational change can be disruptive, but is almost always ultimately valuable. Change should be a normal consequence of learning, and this is to be expected in projects. Learning can stabilize delivery, remove hidden risks, and sometimes reveal that a project or approach should change direction or be cancelled outright. The real risk is not that information change itself. The real risk is assuming that the plan should remain stable while the information is still evolving. Here's an example that I found reading Primus, Flubiart, and Van Wie, who cited the UK-France Channel Tunnel. The Channel Tunnel assumed significantly higher volumes of people travelling between the UK and France, since the competition at the time was a ferry. The tunnel turned a day-long trip into a few hours, from the middle of London to the middle of Paris. Yet the rise of short-haul, low-frills airlines like EasyJet, Jet2, and Ryanair made flying to France cheaper still, even if total journey time was comparable. The upshot was the volume of travellers estimated to use the tunnel being wrong. I'm a great fan of the Channel Tunnel, it's a wonderful way to travel, but those assumptions meant that the payback period for the project was much longer than expected. This is a great example of new information challenging long-held assumptions in megaprojects. But dealing with change and new information is not all bad. With an example from Gill and Tether from 2010, we return to the UK. BAA, in building Heathrow Airport, recognised that regulations, technology and security change constantly in airport provision. Where possible, BAA allowed emergent information to impact design until the last responsible moment. This helped avoid infamously expensive change orders. As we can see, both the knowledge that change happens and contracting strategies to deal with it exist, yet we still all too often contract for megaprojects as if learning new things doesn't happen at all. So we've talked about information and knowledge change, but what about structural change? Structural change is less visible but often more consequential. It's where the decision environment itself changes, and it's where we move from an unpredictable environment to a predictable one or vice versa. Early phases of projects are frequently exploratory. Cause and effect relationships are unclear, forecasts are unstable, experts disagree, and dependencies are uncertain. As knowledge matures, some areas stabilize, work becomes predictable, sequencing becomes clearer, and execution discipline becomes possible. However, this progression is not always one way. Unexpected events can push delivery back into exploratory conditions, for example, late technical discoveries, supplier failure, regulatory intervention, and technology integration challenges. All of those can reintroduce uncertainty. So we can see that projects move between decision domains. They go from uncertain to certain, unpredictable to predictable, and they can also go the other way. Management where there is a lot of change and uncertainty is very different from where there is stability and certainty, and recognizing that movement is critical. So how do we know when a project's predictability is changing? Leaders can detect this movement through observable signals. Here are a few examples. Forecasts become volatile, coordination and dependency management load increases, decisions take longer, and there can be growing disagreement between specialists. Another one is governance friction rising. These are not always signs of poor execution. They may indicate that the nature of the problem has changed. I've seen this in the projects that I've been lucky to work with. I was working with one of the world's largest mining companies and noticed that different skills within the same team needed different support, especially in context setting with executive decision makers. Some people had information that changed multiple times per day, others information that might remain static for months. That caused friction, guesswork, and miscommunication, which delayed good decision making. We made a small change that made work streams visible but separate, which helped set expectations on when sound decision making could occur. In another example, at an oil and gas client, I was with a consulting team mapping Schwaber and Sutherland's Scrum framework to a capital project concept select phase. It worked well enough. But as we moved into detailed design, we noticed that experts knew more but needed longer between meetings, so we made customizations to project management. In the emergent concept select phase, constantly changing information was made bearable by frequent structured communication. In the detail phase, we gave experts time and breadth to both detail their ideas and explore dependencies. The two types of change, which is informational change and structural change, expose risk differently. Information change can increase or reduce risk. Where most of the time learning reduces risk, badly timed or sudden new information can, on a technicality, introduce risk simply by merit of making a team aware of a previously unknown risk. And to avert a conclusion, new information does not automatically push a project towards certainty. To put it another way, learning something doesn't always make your project more predictable. That means while rare, you can have informational change going one way but structural change going the other. There's an example from the Manhattan Project. General Groves, who acted as a coordinator, encouraged experimentation and concurrent alternative seeking as a normal part of project management. That's a clear demonstration of project management deferring to the changing contexts and information. On the other hand, structural change alters how predictable work itself is. Management approaches suited to stable environments can fail in exploratory ones, and conversely, approaches designed for uncertainty can create inefficiency and frustration once stability is achieved. The greatest exposure occurs when leadership assumes stability while the project context is still shifting. So in the context of change, the highest risk is not that some new information happens, it's that the project has shifted from predictable to unpredictable and we're still managing as if it's predictable. So how might leadership respond to change? Well, because projects move through different decision environments with constantly changing information, management styles must evolve. Generally speaking, in early phases, stage decisions that can be committed but reversed, test assumptions, preserve options, and prioritize learning. In middle phases, drive convergence, map dependencies, stabilize sequencing, and reduce exposure. And then in later phases, emphasize execution discipline, control variance, and deliver predictably. Applying the same deterministic management approach throughout the lifecycle creates structural risk. Stability assumptions often create exposure rather than reduce it. So what about the commercial reality? If change is both informational and structural, an important question follows. Why do delivery systems often behave as if certainty already exists? And why are major commitments made assuming plans will remain stable? These questions are not about avoiding commitment. They're about reorganizing how commercial and governance structures shape behavior. When systems demand premature precision, teams may lock in assumptions that later prove incorrect. Consequences often become visible only much later in delivery. So why does this matter? Well, you might think that you're removing risk with a deterministic plan. In fact, the opposite might be happening. It depends on the contexts and what's changing. Management approaches that work in predictable environments can fail in exploratory ones, and approaches designed for uncertainty can create inefficiency once stability is achieved. Changing information is generally additive and good, but it can be disruptive. Project management responses need to be adaptive. Performance isn't about preventing change, it's about recognizing what kind of change is happening and responding appropriately.